Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are going to pick up with the Ramban on chapter 16, verse 8. We read yesterday the pasuk involving the two goats, or the pasukim involving the two goats, and one goat is brought as an offering to God, and one goat is sent crashing down the cliff, and it's described as La'azazel, and it's clearly represents some kind of evil, other god, something in this world, and obviously it's a very difficult thing to wrap the mind around. So we're going to see the Ramban on this. It's not the beginning of the Ramban on Pasuk Ches. It's actually a pretty lengthy Ramban. I'm going to begin with the words V'hinei HaTorah Asra L'gamrei. In my layout, it's a new paragraph. It's like the sixth paragraph or so in the Ramban. It's probably around 60% of the way through the Ramban, maybe 70% of the way through the Ramban. Okay. V'hinei HaTorah Asra L'gamrei Kabbalas Elohusam. The Torah completely prohibits upon us acceptance of other gods, right? It's kind of like one of the 10 commandments. V'chol avoda lahem, and all types of service to those other gods. Avot tziva kadosh baruch hu b'yom HaKippurim shenishlach soir b'midbar l'sar hamoshel b'mkomos hachurban. But God tells us on Yom Kippur to send a goat into the desert to the power that governs over places of destruction. Very difficult to understand. V'ru hu haroy lo b'pnei shehu ba'alav u'me'atzilos kocho yovel chorev u'shmamon ki hu ha'ila l'kochvei ha'cherev v'adam v'mochamos v'amrivos v'aptsoim v'amakos v'apir v'achurban v'aklal nefesh l'galgal madim. So he says that this power to which the sawyer is sent is sort of the power of all kind of bad in this world. It's the power of the constellations involving the sword and blood and war and arguments and wounds and injuries and pirud, when people separate from each other, and destruction. V'chelko min ha'umos hu Esav. And if we were going to point to a nation that represents this idea, it's the nation of Esav. Shu am hayoresh hacherev v'hamulchamos. It's the nation which has inherited the sword and war. Umin habehemos haseirim v'ha'izim. And actually, for whatever reason, animals that represent these ideas are goats. Ubechelko od hashedim. Another thing that kind of goes into this category of general bad things in this world and war and strife and is mazikin, these, for lack of a better translation, demons. He says it's not a coincidence that Esav is sometimes referred to as Seir, like we're talking about Har Seir, the mountain of Seir, and so the animal that we're talking about is the Sa'ir, and Esav is referred to as Seir sometimes. The Eina Kavana B'Sari B'Shtalech Shia Korban Meitanu Elav Chalila. But, says the Ramban, if people are not confused enough yet, the Ramban says, just to clarify, it's not that we're bringing an offering to this force. Our intent is we send this animal to these forces because that's what God wants us to do. Okay, still not so clear what's going on. V'amashal was this. So the Ramban says, let's think about the following metaphor. Kimisha asa suda la'adon. A person made a feast in honor of a master. V'tziva ha'adon esuishos asuda tain mana achas la'avdi ploni. And the master says to the servant, I want you to give a certain portion to such and such a servant of mine. In other words, you're making the meal for me, but there's somebody at the end of the table who's going to be coming. I want you to give something to them. Give a nice portion to them. Sheina osa asuda no saying klum le'everahu v'lo l'chvodo yaseimo. When the servant gives that generous portion to that other person, he's not honoring that person. Rakakol nasan lo'adon. He's giving it all to the master. V'ha'adon nosim pras la'avdo. And the master in turn is imparting a portion to that servant at the end of the table. V'shamar zeh mitzvaso. The servant who made the meal has done his commandment. V'yasel l'chvod ha'adon kol asher tzivo. And everything that he did in honor of the master. V'amnon ha'adam lechem laso al balasuda ratza shi kol avodav nanin mimenu shisaper b'shvacho v'lo b'gnuso. But the master wanted to include that servant at the end of the table for whatever reason the master wanted it. Wanted that servant to also, think highly of the master. V'zeh tam hagorelos. This is the idea of the lots. Ki'ilu haya koin makdish osam b'peh l'Hashem v'la'azazel haya ka'oved elav v'nodeh l'shmo. Very interesting thing. This whole model of the goats is a very difficult thing. The whole model of the lots with the goats is a very difficult thing to understand. Again, it's great for drushes, but without the homiletics for a second, so we can only figure out which animal goes where by a lottery system. What's that all about? So the Ramban says, because if you wouldn't, we need to designate what's what. It can't be that we just, kind of treat them all in the same, they're having very different paths here. So the Ramban says, what's the alternative if there's not lots? The alternative is the Kohen will say the words, this animal is Lashem, and this animal is Lazazel. And that sounds like the Kohen, who's representing Klal Yisrael in service, is dedicating this animal to the service of Azazel, which is the antithesis of what we're talking about. Just to run back to the mushal for a moment, it's the difference between the caterer, the servant who's the caterer, coming and making a presentation to the servant at the end of the table saying, this is the portion I've made for you. The difference between that and the caterer just going and quietly putting a portion down by that servant at the end of the table. I'm not making it for him. I'm making it for the master. The master told me to put it there. If the master told me to put it on the roof, I would have put it on the roof. The master told me to put it here, so this is where I'm putting it. That's how the Kohen is treating the goat for us also. He doesn't say the words Lazazel. He doesn't say the word Lazazel, and he stations both goats before God at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Ki shneim matana l'Hashem. Both of them are a gift to God. And the instruction from God is that you should give this animal to Azazel. Fine, but it's a service of God. By the way, who's going to decide which animal is Lashem, which animal is Lazazel? If it's a lot, what you're saying is God is deciding. So God, I'm putting, because God will decide whichever one I pull out. I'm putting both animals in front of the tent of meeting because this is all about you. And you know what? You'll tell me which goat should go to this and which goat should go to that. I'm not going to get involved with it. And after the lots, the Kohen stations the goat before God. Lomar shehu shelo. The goat is God's. The only intent we have is to do the service of God. Okay. The goat that's sent to Azazel, it says, it will be stationed alive before God to atone for him, to send to the desert. By the way, says the Ramban, we don't slaughter the goat to Azazel, because the slaughter of the goat to Azazel again makes it seem like we're bringing an offering to some other deity or some other force. There is no such thing that we'd be bringing an offering to other than God. So we just send the goat off alive and it crashes to its death, but that's God's department. Okay. V'tirge munklos l'shma d'Hashem u'l'Azazel ki yo'echad l'shem Hashem v'lo lo v'asheni l'Azazel v'lo l'shmo shel Azazel. A very interesting nuance that he cites from the Unklis, as we've said different times before. The Unklis is generally speaking an Aramaic literal translation of the pasuk, but every now and then there's a little smidgen of a nuance that it really speaks volumes. So the Unklis says one goat is Lishma Dashem, in the name of God, and the other one is La Zazel. It doesn't say L'Shem of Azazel. That's like the name of Azazel. And again, it implies that the first one is in honor of God, and the second one is where God told us to send it, which is to Azazel. There's this famous medrash that talks about things that the evil inclination questions, and the nations of the world make comments. That's right. I mean, we can make our own list of mitzvahs that we don't really understand. It's hard to wrap the mind around, and people malign us for it or make fun of us for it, and our own evil inclinations sometimes bring us confusion about it. So it gives an example of Levisa Shatnez. Why is it a big deal not to mix wool in our garments? Upara Duma, the red heifer. You understand the red heifer? What are you making your business with the red heifer for? And it also mentions this goat that gets sent off as something that's so hard to wrap the mind around. By sacrifices, that's not one of the things on the list. That's not like one of these hard ones. How do you understand the concept of bringing a korban? Because the sacrifices are an offering to God. But when it comes to the goat that gets sent off, they'll ask questions to us. Because the nations of the world will look at it and say, oh, you're just like us. We bring to this deity and that deity, and you're also, Yom Kippur is your special day to bring to all the different deities. That's very nice. So they'll say to us, what are you doing? He says, you know why Paraduma, the red heifer, is on the list? Not because of the whole Tamei Tahor thing. I mean, if it was because of the whole Tamei Tahor thing, you could have had a long, extensive list about it. He says aspects of the Paraduma are done outside of the camp, and it's about impurity. And it sounds like it's sort of like serving another force or something. So that's why it's on the list, just like Sorry Mishtaleach. Okay. Okay. So I think we've spent a good amount of time on this Ramban. Just want to summarize what the Ramban said, and I think it's far from clear at this point, but at least it's a little bit to wrap the mind around. First of all, the Ramban explains that the idea of the goat Azazel represents the forces of evil in this world, and that God wants us to do something to recognize the forces of evil in this world. And maybe the best way to say it, I think, is to look at it as follows. The Ramban did not say what I'm about to say. So if it doesn't make sense to you, it's me. It's not the Ramban. Maybe the best way to think about it is, remember the Ramban's mashal was that when I'm bringing, it's not that I'm bringing a sacrifice to the God of Azazel, Chas v'shalom. It's that the master told me to bring a portion to that person at the end of the table. So in a sense, I think you could argue that by bringing a goat as a korban and then sending a goat to the forces of Be'ad in service of God, I think you could argue that it's actually a recognition that even the things that we don't like in this world are part of the world that God created. In other words, let's say it this way. Are we happy that Russia is attacking Ukraine? And whatever Russia's doing right now, we're not happy about it. We're very disturbed by it, okay? So who's at fault? Now, so there are some people who would say, well, God's doing it. I don't know if I would say that. I mean, God brings free choice to the world. I don't think we should assume that Vladimir Putin is being compelled by God to wage war against Ukraine. I don't think so. I certainly wouldn't assume that. But I'll tell you one thing for sure. God is allowing it to happen. You could say it different ways. You could say God is facilitating it. You could say God allowed a person like Putin to be in power in the first place. You could say God put ideas in Putin's head, but not forced him to do it. But you could say all kinds of things. But the bottom line is God's allowing it to happen. Why is God allowing it to happen? We don't know, and we won't know. But the one thing that we know is the world that we live in has evil in it, has bad in it. And that's part of God's creation. I think the idea of the goat Tazazel brings home the following idea. I think what it brings home is, if every time I see something bad in the world, I say, well, this is the hand of God. I don't know, and people do bad things and they have free will. But I do have to say, this is part of the world that God created. And God didn't want there to be only good in the world. God wanted there to be bad in the world. That's part of the complicated world that we live in that God wanted to have. So by sending something to Azazel as part of our service to God, I think we're sort of making that point. I hope that makes a little bit of sense to people.